My mother's tears have a special sound. It's a theatrical production in 3 acts. First, the sharp intake of breath that signals the emotional dam breaking. Then the staccato sobs that build to a crescendo. And finally, the grand finale. A prolonged, mournful wail that sounds like someone slowly deflating a bagpipe made of guilt. I've become such an expert at identifying these sounds that I can now predict, down to the second, exactly when she'll reach for the tissues after I mention that no, I'm not currently seeing anyone special. And no, I don't have any promising first dates lined up. And yes, I just signed another year-long lease on my apartment. Alone. But Sydney, she'll say between expertly timed sniffles, you're 31. As if I might have forgotten this detail. As if my age is a terminal diagnosis with a rapidly approaching expiration date. You know what I was doing at 31? She'll continue, not waiting for my response, because this is a script we've performed monthly since my 25th birthday. I had been married for 8 years and had you and your brother. I had a family. The unspoken accusation hangs between us. And what do you have? Only a corner office at Peterson and Marks Consulting. Only a restored brownstone in Boston's South End that I purchased last year. Only a passport stamped with 23 countries. Only a life that I've built precisely as I wanted it. But in my mother's eyes, without a husband and children, I might as well be living in a cardboard box under a bridge, collecting bottle caps and talking to pigeons. Last Sunday's performance began right on schedule. I'd called for our weekly check-in, forgetting that it was the 3rd Sunday of the month, what I've come to think of as Sydney's Spinsterhood Awareness Day. The exact day when my mother seems to realise anew that her only daughter remains, catastrophically unmarried. Guess who I ran into at Whole Foods? She began innocently enough, though I immediately recognised the setup. Jennifer Abernathy, you remember her? You two were in Girl Scouts together. Well, she just had her 3rd. Baby? A little girl after 2 boys? Perfect family. I made a non-committal noise while scrolling through work emails. Jennifer Abernathy had once eaten a worm on a dare and then vomited on my shoes. I wasn't particularly invested in her reproductive achievements. She asked about you, my mother continued. I told her you were still... She paused dramatically. Focused on your career. The way she said career made it sound like I'd chosen to dedicate my life to something truly depraved, like taxidermy for household pets, or perhaps professional arson. I am, I confirmed, reviewing a client proposal. The Singapore project is going well. We might expand to... She's younger than you know. Jennifer, 2 years younger. And there it was. The opening salvo. Is she? I asked with forced lightness. Good for her. Her husband's a doctor, paediatrician. They just bought that beautiful colonial on Maple Street, the one with the wraparound porch. Sounds lovely, I said, my jaw tightening. You know, if you'd just let me set you up with David Greenberg's son... Mum, we've discussed this. I'm not interested in being set up with anyone right now. I closed my laptop, surrendering to the inevitable conversation. I'm happy with my life as it is. The sharp intake of breath. Right on cue. How can you be happy? You're all alone. The staccato sobs began. I checked my watch. 17 seconds until the wail. I just don't understand what I did wrong. She managed between sobs. Was it because I worked when you were little? Did that make you like this? 13 seconds. Like what exactly? I asked, though I knew precisely what she meant. So independent. So unwilling to compromise. Men don't want to feel unnecessary. Sydney? 5 seconds. I'm not looking to make anyone feel necessary or unnecessary, Mum. I'm just living my life. And there it was. The wail. The grand finale. The sound of my mother's dreams for my life circling the drain of my stubborn autonomy. I just want you to be happy, she cried. I am happy, I insisted, my voice rising despite my best efforts to remain calm. I'm actually extremely happy. What you want is for me to make you happy by living the life you think I should have. The line went quiet except for her sniffling. I deviated from the script. Normally, this was where I'd apologise, make vague promises about being more open to meeting someone, and change the subject to something safer, like my brother's perfect marriage, his perfect children, and his perfectly predictable life in suburbia. But something had shifted inside me. Maybe it was turning 31 last month. Maybe it was finalising the purchase of my brownstone, the home where I planned to build a life on my own terms. Or maybe it was simply the cumulative weight of 1,000 tears shed not for my actual sorrows, but for my mother's imagined uns. I have to go, I said into the loaded silence. I'll talk to you next week. I hung up before she could respond, before she could pull me back into the orbit of her disappointment. Then I did something I'd never done after one of these conversations. I didn't immediately text an apology. I didn't promise to call back later. I simply sat in my sun-drenched living room, surrounded by the life I'd chosen, and let myself feel something other than guilt. It felt like freedom. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrified but exhilarated by the view. It felt like the beginning of something dangerous, and with Mother's Day just 3 weeks away, the timing couldn't have been worse, or better, depending on how you looked at it. The guilt, of course, crept back in by morning. It always did. Catholic school may be 20 years behind me, but guilt remains my most fluent second language. You look like hell, observed my assistant, Zoe, as I trudged into my office Monday morning. At 24, she possessed both the metabolism and the frank speaking style of youth. Mommy issues again? I shot her a warning look as I set down my coffee. I don't pay you to psychoanalyse me. Actually, you kind of do. Anticipate needs before they're expressed is literally in my job description. She perched on the edge of my desk, utterly unfazed. And right now, you need someone to tell you that it's not your responsibility to fulfill your mother's thwarted dreams by producing grandbabies on demand. I sighed, sinking into my chair. How do you do that? Do what? Distill my entire existential crisis into one perfectly accurate sentence before I've even had my coffee, she shrugged. Gift. Also, you mutter the same things every time you get off the phone with her. I'm not a baby factory. My uterus is not a timeshare. I'm a person, not a sequel. I do not say that last one. You absolutely do, last month, after the Easter brunch debacle. I winced, recalling the disaster of introducing my mother to my new neighbour, a divorced father of 3 whom she'd immediately assessed as rehabilitation material. She'd slipped him my phone number without my knowledge. He'd texted later that day. Your mum seems nice, very enthusiastic about your unused childbearing potential. I hadn't been able to make eye contact with him in the hallway since. Anyway, Zoe continued, sliding a folder across my desk, the Singapore team needs your sign-off on these projections by noon, and your mother sent flowers. She what? Zoe gestured toward reception. Huge arrangement. Card says, to my beautiful daughter who still has time to make the right choices. Exact quote, I groaned, dropping my head to the desk. She's escalating. Want me to put them in the conference room? Say they're from a client? No, I said, straightening. Send them to the children's hospital down the street. Anonymous donation. Zoe nodded approvingly. And the card? Shred it. Then burn the shreds. Then bury the ashes at a crossroads at midnight. She grinned. That's the boss I know and love. Now, about the Richardson account. And just like that, we were back to business. The familiar rhythm of work, concrete problems with definable solutions, settled around me like a comfortable blanket. Here, success wasn't measured by my marital status or the contents of my womb. Here, I was valued for my mind, my strategic thinking, and my ability to anticipate market shifts. Here I was enough exactly as I was. The day passed in a productive blur. I deliberately avoided checking my phone for text from my mother, apologies for overstepping, likely accompanied by links to articles with titles like Professional Women Finding Love After 30, It's Possible. Or Freezing Your Eggs, A Modern Woman's Insurance Policy. Instead, I focused on finalising our Asia-Pacific expansion strategy, had lunch with the CFO to discuss next quarter's projections, and spent an hour mentoring a promising junior analyst who reminded me painfully of myself at 25, brilliant but constantly apologizing for taking up space. "Stop qualifying your statements," I told her, after she'd prefaced a perfectly sound observation with, "This might be stupid, but," for the third time. "If you don't believe in your analysis, why should anyone else?" She blinked, startled by my directness. "I just don't want to seem arrogant." "There's a vast territory between self-deprecation and arrogance," I said more gently. "It's called confidence. I suggest you move there permanently." Her tentative smile was like looking into a mirror of my past self, always seeking approval, always afraid of overstepping. I wondered if she had her own version of my mother at home, measuring her against impossible standards. Probably. Things tended to be generational, passed down like China patterns or genetic predispositions to heart disease. By 6 o'clock, I'd successfully navigated an entire day without dwelling on my mother's disappointment. I was almost proud of myself as I packed up my laptop and headed for the elevator. "Oh, Sydney," Zoe called after me. "Your mum called the office line 4 times. I told her you were in meetings." My momentary peace evaporated. What did she want? She didn't say. Just that it was a family matter of great importance. With my mother, that could mean anything from an actual emergency to finding a sale on wedding venues that offered mature bride discounts. I sighed, pulling out my phone and bracing myself. 5 missed calls, 12 texts, each more urgent than the last, culminating in, "Please call immediately, life-changing opportunity you can't miss." I debated waiting until I got home, pouring a substantial glass of wine first, but the residual good daughter in me wouldn't allow it. I called from the lobby. She answered on the first ring. "Finally, I've been trying to reach you all day." "I was working, Mom. You know, at my job. The career you think is a placeholder until my real life begins." She ignored the jab. "Well, you'll thank me for the interruption when you hear my news." "I've found him." A chill ran down my spine. "Found who?" "Your perfect match, Richard Hoffman's son. You remember Richard from Dad's golf club? His son just moved back to Boston after working in finance in New York for years. He's divorced. No children, and Rich says he's looking to settle down with the right woman." I stepped outside, the spring air suddenly insufficient for my lungs. "Let me get this straight. You've been harassing me all day because you want to set me up with a divorced golfer's son?" "He's not just a golfer, Sydney. Richard is on the hospital board, and Michael, that's his son, graduated from Wharton. He's exactly the kind of man you should be with." "Based on what? His father's golf handicap, his Ivy League pedigree, the fact that he's already failed at one marriage?" "Sydney," she gasped, "that's a terrible thing to say. Divorce happens to good people." "So does singlehood," I retorted. "Yet you treat mine like a terminal illness." "I've already told Richard. You'd love to meet Michael. He's taking you to dinner on Friday at Sorrelina, 7:30. The casual commandeering of my time, my life, ignited something molten in my chest. "No." "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no. I will not be going to dinner with Michael Hoffman or any other man you select from your country club breeding program. I have plans on Friday." "What plans?" she demanded, skepticism dripping from each syllable. "Plans that don't require your approval or supervision," I snapped. "My time is mine, Mom. My life is mine. I'm not a project for you to manage. I'm just trying to help. You clearly need it. Do you want to end up alone, with nothing but your job to keep you warm at night?" "If that's what I choose." "Yes," I nearly shouted, drawing a curious glance from a man walking his dog. I lowered my voice. "And for the record, my job doesn't just keep me warm, it fulfills me intellectually, challenges me daily, and yes, pays for the very nice bedding that keeps me physically warm at night. All without leaving dirty socks on the floor, or snoring." The silence on the other end of the line had a particular quality, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on the wounded martyr tone that had been weaponized against me since childhood. "I don't understand why you're being so hostile. I'm only thinking of your happiness." "No." You're thinking of your happiness. Of how you'll look to your friends when you can finally stop making excuses for your spinster daughter. Of how you imagined your life would be by now, surrounded by grandchildren, watching me live out the sequel to your story. I was breathing hard, standing still in the middle of the sidewalk as Boston moved around me, suddenly feeling the weight of expectations I'd been carrying for decades. That's not true, she protested, but weakly. I know what you want, I interrupted. You've been telling me, showing me for years, and I'm done apologizing for not delivering it. I ended the call and turned off my phone completely, something I hadn't done since, possibly ever. The silence was immediate and shocking, like stepping from a crowded street into an empty cathedral. For a moment, I simply stood there, feeling simultaneously weightless and anchored, like I'd finally put down a burden I'd been carrying so long. I'd forgotten it wasn't part of my body. Then I hailed a cab and went home to my empty brownstone, which suddenly didn't feel empty at all. It felt like exactly what it was. Mine. The 3 weeks between that conversation and Mother's Day unfolded in a series of escalating maternal offensives and my increasingly firm boundaries. First came the email forwarded from Richard Hoffman himself, extolling his son's virtues and expressing disappointment that I couldn't make Friday's dinner. Perhaps another time. Delete. Then the chance encounter with my mother's neighbour's daughter at my regular coffee shop, a woman I'd met perhaps twice, who coincidentally needed advice about consulting careers and mentioned 3 times that she had an adorable single brother. I'm not interested, I told her firmly. And please tell my mother that sending reconnaissance teams into my daily life is not going to work. The woman had at least the grace to look embarrassed. Next came the delivery of a self-help book to my office, Balancing Ambition and Family, Having It All After 30. The inscription read, "Thought you might find this insightful." The author was also very career-focused until she found her true purpose. Love, Mum. Donated to the office book exchange with a sticky note. Free to a good home, or a bad one. I'm not judging. By the second week, my mother had shifted tactics from matchmaking to medical concerns. I've been reading about geriatric pregnancy risks, she announced during our weekly call, which I'd finally resumed after 3 days of avoidance. I'm 31, not 90, I replied, and not pregnant, or trying to be. That's exactly my point. The term geriatric pregnancy applies to women over 35, which is less than 4 years away for you. Did you know your chances of conceiving naturally decrease by 15% every... Mum. I cut her off. I appreciate your concern for my theoretical future children. But right now, the only thing I'm trying to birth is the Peterson account, and trust me, it's being plenty demanding. You can joke all you want, Sydney, but biology doesn't care about your career milestones. Fortunately, I don't care about biology's opinion of my life choices. I changed the subject to my brother's kids, always a reliable diversion, and managed to survive the rest of the call without further fertility statistics. By the 3rd week, with Mother's Day looming, an uneasy truce had settled between us. She'd stopped sending eligible bachelors into my path like heat-seeking missiles, and I'd stopped hanging up on her mid-sentence. Progress, of a sort. I even dutifully ordered the traditional Mother's Day arrangement from her favourite florist. Lavish, expensive, and guaranteed to earn prime placement in her Facebook photos. I selected a suitably bland card with pre-printed sentiments about maternal wisdom and sacrifice. Signed it, Love Sydney, without additional commentary, Esquire. Closed. Obligation fulfilled, except it wasn't. And it hadn't been, for years. The revelation came 3 days before Mother's Day, as I sat in my office reviewing a presentation. On the wall opposite my desk hung a photograph of my mother and me, taken at my MBA graduation 6 years earlier. In it, she's beaming with pride, her arm around my shoulders. I'm smiling too, though there's a tightness around my eyes that I recognise now as anxiety. Even in my moment of achievement, I'd been scanning her face for signs of disapproval. Had it always been like this? This complicated dance of pride and disappointment, of conditional love based on how closely I adhered to her vision for my life? Yes, I realised. It had. When I was 7 and announced I wanted to be an astronaut, she'd smiled indulgently and said, "Wouldn't you rather be a teacher? Teachers get summers off to be with their children." When I was 15 and won the state math championship, she'd framed the certificate, but wondered aloud if boys might find my intelligence intimidating. When I was 22 and accepted my first corporate job instead of the teaching position, she'd always envisioned for me, she'd asked, "But what about when you have a family? Those hours won't leave time for what really matters." Always the same message, delivered in 1,000 different ways. Your achievements are lovely, but they're just placeholders until your real purpose begins. Until you become a wife, a mother, a reflection of me. I stared at the photograph, seeing it with new clarity. We looked similar, the same dark hair and high cheekbones, the same determined set to our jaws. People often remarked on the resemblance. "Like mother, like daughter," they'd say, and my mother would beam while something in me silently rebelled. Because we weren't alike, not really. My mother had married her high school sweetheart at 23, had my brother at 24, me at 27, had built her entire identity around her family, viewing her part-time job at the school district office as a necessary evil rather than a source of fulfillment. I'd chosen differently, built differently, valued differently, and maybe that was the heart of it. Not that I'd rejected marriage and motherhood outright, but that I didn't center them as the defining purpose of my existence. That I could imagine a full, meaningful life without them, that I wasn't her, and she couldn't forgive me for it. I took the photo off the wall, studying it. Then I placed it face down in my desk drawer and pulled out a legal pad. "Zoe," I called. "Cancel my lunch and get me contact information for a specialty print shop, one that can do rush orders on custom greeting cards." Mother's Day dawned. Bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that normally would have put me in a good mood. Instead, I felt like I was preparing for battle as I dressed for the traditional family brunch at my parents' suburban home. The flowers had been delivered the day before, arrangement number 4 from Mason's florist, the premium mother's tribute. My brother and his family would arrive with handmade cards from my niece and nephew, probably a spa gift certificate, and the easy confidence of people who'd fulfilled familial expectations without friction. And I would arrive with my custom card, its glossy surface burning a hole in my handbag like a concealed weapon. I debated all night whether to actually give it to her, whether the momentary satisfaction would be worth the inevitable fallout, whether I could simply continue our détente indefinitely, a cold war of passive-aggressive comments and strategic avoidance. But something in me had hardened, or perhaps softened, in these weeks of confrontation. Some threshold had been crossed. I was done contorting myself to fit into the negative space of my mother's expectations. The drive to my childhood home took 40 minutes. I spent them rehearsing various scenarios, from tearful reconciliation, unlikely, to being dramatically disowned, possible but improbable, given my mother's flair for prolonged emotional sieges. By the time I pulled into the familiar driveway, I'd settled into a calm resignation. Whatever happened, I would finally be honest, with her and with myself. "Sydney." My mother greeted me at the door with the effusive enthusiasm she reserved for public performances of maternal devotion. "You're here. Everyone's in the garden. Your flowers are absolutely gorgeous. The biggest arrangement Mason's has done all season," they said. I returned her embrace stiffly, noting that she'd already dressed for brunch in a floral dress and pearls, her uniform for family occasions where photographs would be taken and subsequently shared with her extensive social network. "Thanks for coming early," she continued, leading me through the house. "I wanted a few minutes just us girls before the chaos. Mimosa?" I accepted the proffered glass, recognizing the peace offering for what it was. The past weeks of tension would be swept aside in favor of the picture-perfect Mother's Day narrative she'd already constructed. Devoted daughter pays homage to selfless mother. No conflict, no lingering resentment, just carefully curated harmony. "Your brother just texted. They're running late. Emma has a dance recital this afternoon, so they can only stay for an hour." I nodded, following her onto the sunlit patio, where the table had been set with her best china and fresh flowers from her garden, supplementing my professional arrangement. "So," she said, settling into a chair and patting the seat beside her. I've been thinking about our disagreement. I raised an eyebrow. Have you? Yes. And I realise I may have been a bit pushy about the whole marriage thing. The understatement was so enormous I almost laughed. A bit? Well, perhaps more than a bit, she conceded with a small smile. It's just that I want you to be happy, Sydney. I am happy, I said, the familiar refrain now automatic. I know you think you are, with your career and your beautiful home. But there's a special kind of happiness that comes from family, from creating life with someone you love, from continuing the bloodline, I suggested, the dynasty, the eternal cycle of women measuring their worth by their reproductive output. Her smile tightened. That's a very cynical way to look at the miracle of family. Is it? Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've spent the past decade measuring my worth by how closely I conform to your life choices. That's not fair. I just don't want you to wake up one day and realise you've missed your chance for what really matters. And there it was, the same message, repackaged in concern, but unchanged in substance. Whatever I'd built, whatever I'd achieved was secondary, disposable. A consolation prize for failing at what really matters. I set down my mimosa and reached for my bag. I brought you something, besides the flowers. Oh? Her expression brightened. Gift-giving was one of her accepted languages of contrition. I withdrew the envelope, its heavy cream paper deceptively traditional. For a moment I hesitated, my courage wavering. Then I handed it to her, watching as she opened it with the expectant smile of someone who believes harmony has been restored. The custom card was beautifully designed, a professional job with embossed lettering and a tasteful floral border. On the front, in elegant script, Happy Mother's Day, standard enough. But inside, beneath the pre-printed "Thank you for everything you've given me," I'd added a custom message. Thank you for not being me, for showing me exactly who I don't want to become, for teaching me that a woman's worth isn't measured by her marital status or the contents of her uterus, but by the strength it takes to resist those who would reduce her to these functions. I am not your sequel. I am not your do-over. I am not the vessel for your unfulfilled dreams. I am my own story, being written on my own terms. For teaching me this difficult but essential lesson, I am genuinely grateful. Love, Sydney. I watched as her eyes scanned the message once, twice. Watched the blood drain from her face, then rush back in a tide of shocked colour. Watched her hands begin to tremble slightly, the heavy cardstock shaking between her manicured fingers. When she looked up, her expression wasn't what I'd expected. Not rage, not even the calculated hurt that usually preceded her tears. It was something I'd rarely seen on my mother's face, genuine surprise. Is this really how you see me? She asked, her voice small. As someone who's tried to force you into being my sequel? The vulnerability in her tone caught me off guard. I'd prepared for anger, for manipulation, for the familiar cycle of tears and guilt. Not for this quiet question that sounded almost reflective. Yes, I said honestly. For as long as I can remember, you've treated my choices as temporary, phases to be tolerated, until I finally come to my senses and live the life you've planned for me. The life you think legitimizes a woman's existence. She flinched, her gaze dropping back to the card. That's not... I never meant... Maybe not consciously, I allowed. But every tear you've shed over my career success, every backhanded compliment about my phase of independence, every ambush with eligible men, they all send the same message. What I've built isn't enough. I'm not enough, not without fulfilling your vision of womanhood. She was quiet for so long I thought she might not respond at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its performative quality, sounding older and more tired than I was used to hearing. I married your father at 23, she said, almost to herself. Had your brother at 24, you at 27. There were things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see. But that's not how it worked then. You got married, you had children, you built your life around them. I stared at her, this familiar stranger suddenly speaking words I'd never heard from her before. I don't regret it, she continued. I love you and your brother more than anything, but sometimes I wonder what else I might have been. The Fae. Admission hung between us, fragile and unexpected. And you see me living that alternate version of your life, I said slowly, understanding dawning. The road not taken, she nodded, still not meeting my eyes. When you talk about your work, your travels, there's this light in you, this certainty. I never had that, never even thought it was possible. So when you push me toward marriage, and children, it's what I know, she said simply. It's the life that gave me purpose, identity. The thought of you without that. She trailed off. Scares you, I finished for her. Because if I can be complete without those things, then maybe I limited myself unnecessarily. She finally looked up, her eyes shining but not with the theatrical tears I was accustomed to. Something more genuine, more painful. It's easier to believe there's only one legitimate path for a woman than to consider the roads I didn't take, Forilus. Revelation settled over us, like a sudden change in atmospheric pressure. Not a complete resolution. Decades of patterns couldn't be undone in a single conversation. But a crack in the foundation, a glimpse into the deeper currents beneath our conflict. I never meant to make you feel less than, she said quietly. I thought I was protecting you from regret. I know, I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. But it's my life to live, my choices to make, my regrets to have or not have. She nodded slowly, looking down at the card again. This is quite a Mother's Day message. Despite everything, I felt a smile tug at my lips. I've never been one. For Hallmark sentiments. No, she agreed, a ghost of an answering smile appearing. You've always been stubbornly original, even as a little girl. She hesitated. I do admire that about you, you know, even when it terrifies me. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, perhaps the first real one she'd ever offered, not of who she wanted me to be, but of who I actually was. They're here! My father's voice called from inside the house, followed by the thundering footsteps of my niece and nephew racing toward the patio. My mother quickly tucked the card back into its envelope, our moment of honesty yielding to the practical reality of family brunch. But something had shifted. Between us, a tectonic movement, subtle but irrevocable. We'll talk more later, she said, straightening her dress as she stood to greet the new arrivals. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. Thank you for the card. It was illuminating. I watched as she transformed back into the polished matriarch, embracing my brother and cooing over my niece's recital costume. The familiar choreography resumed, coffee poured, pastries distributed, compliments exchanged. But as I took my place at the table, accepting a sticky hug from my nephew and fielding my father's questions about work, I felt different. Lighter. As if I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for so long, I'd forgotten it wasn't actually part of me. For the first time in memory, I sat through a family gathering without constantly monitoring my mother's reactions, without filtering my responses through the lens of her expectations. I spoke about her upcoming business trip to Tokyo with genuine enthusiasm, listened to my brother's suburban adventures with sincere interest rather than comparative anxiety, existed as myself, not as a disappointment or a project or a checklist of unfulfilled potential. When the inevitable group photo was suggested, I didn't automatically angle myself to appear smaller or position myself at the edge where I could be easily cropped out. I stood at the centre of my family, neither apologising for my presence nor diminishing it. Say, Happy Mother's Day, my father instructed, holding up his phone. Happy Mother's Day, we chorused, and as the shutter clicked, capturing this moment of performed family harmony, I caught my mother's eye across the table. The look that passed between us wasn't resolution, We had decades of patterns to unravel, generations of expectation to examine, but it was acknowledgement, of truth spoken, of reality seen, of two women recognizing each other not as failed mirror images, but as separate stories unfolding according to their own internal logic. I'd come to brunch expecting battle and found, instead, the first tentative steps towards something I'd never thought possible with my mother: mutual recognition. Not as mother and daughter, roles laden with expectation and history, but as two women at different points on their own distinct journeys. She might never fully understand my choices, might never stop hoping I'd eventually conform to her vision of womanhood, but something fundamental had changed in the garden that Mother's Day morning. Not a complete transformation, but a crack in the facade, a glimpse behind the curtain at the complicated woman who had raised me. A woman who, in her own way, had been shaped by the same pressures she now exerted on me. Who had traded one set of possibilities for another, as we all must, and who now watched her daughter choose differently with a complex mixture of fear, envy, and reluctant admiration. I didn't know what would come next, whether this moment of honesty would lead to lasting change or simply a more sophisticated version of our old patterns. But I knew I had finally spoken my truth, and miraculously been heard. For today, that was enough. Tomorrow would unfold according to its own logic, and for the first time in my adult life, I would face it without the weight of unspoken resentment bending my spine. The freedom felt vertiginous and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a precipice and finally deciding to fly rather than retreat to safer ground. Not her sequel, not her do-over. Not her dream deferred, just me. Sydney. Age 31. Unmarried. Uncompromised. Enough. 3 months after that fateful Mother's Day, I sat across from my mother at a small cafe in downtown Boston. This had become our new tradition, meeting on neutral ground rather than in the emotionally charged atmosphere of my childhood home. Away from the performative aspects of family gatherings where roles were too easily slipped back into like comfortable old clothes. "I like what you've done with your hair," she said, stirring her latte. "The highlights suit you." "Thanks," I replied, touching the caramel streaks my stylist had convinced me to try. It was time for a change. She nodded, something almost wistful crossing her features. Change. Yes. Speaking of which. I tensed slightly, anticipating the usual pivot to my relationship status. Old habits die hard, after all. "I've enrolled in a photography class," she continued instead. "At the community college. It starts next week." I blinked, surprised. "Photography? I didn't know you were interested in that." A slight flush coloured her cheeks. "I've always been, actually. I used to borrow your grandfather's camera in high school. Had quite the eye for composition," he said. She shrugged. "But then came marriage and babies, and there never seemed to be time." Her voice trailed off, but I heard the echo of our Mother's Day conversation in the silence. The roads not taken, the versions of herself set aside. "That's wonderful, Mom," I said, meaning it. "What kind of photography interests you most?" The question opened a floodgate. She spoke animatedly about black and white techniques, architectural studies, the play of light and shadow. I watched her face transform, years seeming to fall away as she described artistic concepts with unexpected fluency. This was a side of my mother I'd never seen, passionate, knowledgeable about something beyond family management and social obligations. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, cutting herself off mid-sentence. "I'm rambling." "No, you're not," I assured her. "You're excited." "It's nice to see." She looked down at her coffee, a familiar gesture of self-dismissal. "It's just a hobby." "Why does it have to be just anything?" I challenged gently. "Why can't it be important? Valuable? Worth pursuing for its own sake?" Her eyes met mine, recognition flickering in their depths. How many times had she dismissed my career with similar minimizing language? How many of my achievements had been framed as just phases, or just stepping stones to the milestones she considered truly significant? "Old habits," she murmured, echoing my earlier thought. I spent so many years believing there was only one path that mattered for a woman. It's difficult to reimagine things at my age. But not impossible, I pointed out. A small smile tugged at her lips. Evidently not. She hesitated, then added with careful nonchalance, "Your father thinks it's a waste of money." I wasn't surprised. My father, though loving in his way, had always reinforced my mother's traditional perspectives. "And what do you think?" She sat straighter, something steely entering her expression. "I think I've spent 40 years prioritizing everyone else's opinions. I think it's time I discovered what matters to me." The echo of my own journey in her words wasn't lost on me. We were travelling opposite paths that had somehow converged at this unexpected intersection, me claiming my right to define success on my own terms, her reclaiming pieces of herself long set aside for others. "To new beginnings," I offered, raising my cup. She clinked her latte against mine. "To self-discovery, at any age." As we finished our coffee and prepared to part ways, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. A gesture so uncharacteristically demonstrative it momentarily startled me. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For your Mother's Day card." She met my gaze steadily. It wasn't easy to read, but sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we need most. I nodded, throat suddenly tight. "I'm sorry if it hurt you." "It did," she acknowledged. "But not because it was cruel, because it was accurate." She squeezed my hand once more before releasing it. "I'm trying to see you more clearly now, and perhaps myself as well." We parted on the sidewalk outside the cafe, her headed to a department store to purchase supplies for her upcoming class, me back to my office for an afternoon of conference calls. Different directions, different priorities. But for perhaps the first time in our complicated relationship, there was no sense that either path was superior, more valid, more worthy of respect. Just two women making their way through the world, according to their own internal compasses. That evening, as I reviewed quarterly projections in my sunlit home office, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother, a rare occurrence, as she still preferred voice calls for their emotional immediacy. It was a photograph. A black and white image of an elderly couple sitting on a park bench, their weathered hands intertwined, faces turned toward each other in a moment of quiet intimacy. The composition was striking, the lighting masterful in its simplicity. Found this in an old album, read her message. Took it the summer before college, before I met your father, before I became mum. Just thought you might like to see what Barbara captured before she disappeared into motherhood. I stared at the image, seeing in it both technical skill and something deeper. A sensitivity, an eye for human connection that transcended mere technical proficiency. My mother had seen these, strangers really seen them, and preserved their moment of tenderness with remarkable clarity. What else might she have created, had she continued down that path? What vision might she have developed? What perspective might she have shared? Questions without answers. Possibilities foreclosed by choices made decades before I was born. Not by me, not by her, but by the narrow definitions of womanhood that had shaped her generation. "It's beautiful," I texted back. "You had a gift." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared as she composed her response. Finally. "Perhaps still do, just dormant, like a seed waiting for the right season." Something expanded in my chest, not the tight knot of resentment I'd carried for so long, but something warmer, more complex. Understanding, perhaps. Compassion. The recognition that my mother's attempts to chart my life had never been simply about control, but about her own unresolved relationship with possibility. "Nothing stays dormant forever," I replied. Looking forward, to seeing what grows. And I realised with mild surprise, genuinely curious to witness this unfolding, this late-blooming exploration of a self long subordinated to others' needs and expectations. The following weekend, I found myself doing something I'd never anticipated, helping my mother set up a small darkroom in what had once been my childhood bedroom. My father's disapproval hung palpably in the air as we converted his neatly maintained guest room into a space dedicated solely to my mother's rediscovered passion. "He'll adjust," she said with unprecedented firmness when I remarked on his obvious displeasure. "As I've adjusted to so many of his hobbies over the years." I glanced at her sharply, noting both the assertiveness and the subtle edge of long-suppressed frustration. Boundaries were being drawn, territories reclaimed, uncomfortable perhaps, but necessary. "Besides," she added, testing the blackout curtains, "we'd installed— I'm not asking permission anymore. That's what I learnt from you, Sydney, from watching you build your life unapologetically." The acknowledgement, so different from her previous framing of my choices as problematic or temporary, rendered me momentarily speechless. "Don't look so shocked," she chuckled, misreading my silence. "Old dogs, new tricks, etc." "It's not that," I managed. "It's just— I never thought of myself as a positive example for you. I always felt like a disappointment." Her hands stilled on the curtain, expressions sobering. "You were never a disappointment. A challenge to my assumptions, yes. A contradiction to my certainties. But never, ever a disappointment." She crossed the room and took my hands in hers, the second spontaneous physical connection in a relationship historically characterized by emotional distance. "I'm proud of you, Sydney. Not despite your choices, but because of them. Because you had the courage to define yourself when I was still letting others define me." The words I'd waited decades to hear, offered freely in a makeshift darkroom that represented her own belated rebellion. Tears pricked at my eyes, embarrassingly adolescent in their intensity. "Don't go soft on me now," she teased gently. "I need your strategic business mind to help me figure out how to tell your father I'm taking a photography retreat in Santa Fe next month." I laughed through the unexpected emotion, squeezing her hands before releasing them. "I think I can manage that. Boardroom negotiations have nothing on family diplomacy." As we finished setting up her equipment, working together with surprising efficiency, I glimpsed the parallel journeys we were navigating, different paths, different timelines, but a shared destination, authenticity, the freedom to exist as ourselves, not as reflections or projections of others' expectations. There would still be difficult moments ahead, old patterns reasserting themselves in times of stress, expectations surfacing in subtle, ingrained ways. The occasional tear shed over my continuing singlehood, the reflexive question about suitable men in my orbit. But something fundamental had shifted, a foundation rebuilt on more solid ground. Not perfect understanding, but genuine seeing. Not complete acceptance, but sincere effort. Not the seamless harmony of her fantasies, but the textured, complex connection of reality. Later that night, as I drove back to Boston with the windows, down and summer air rushing around me, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with release from guilt. This was something different. The buoyancy of authenticity recognized and honored, however imperfectly. I thought of the custom mother's day card that had catalyzed this transformation, the words that had seemed so confrontational, so final in their declaration of independence, had actually opened a door I'd assumed forever closed. Not to reconciliation on her terms, or capitulation to her vision of womanhood, but to something I'd never imagined possible, mutual recognition of each other's sovereign right to self-definition. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text from my mother. Another photograph, this one clearly just taken. My father, caught in profile against the evening light, his expression softened with an affection rarely displayed so openly. First official portrait from the new darkroom, read her message. Turns. Out there are still undiscovered facets, even in subjects I thought I knew completely. I smiled, recognizing the deeper truth in her artistic observation. We were all still revealing ourselves, still discovering hidden angles and unexpected dimensions. Still capable of surprise, of growth, of becoming. At the next stoplight I typed a quick reply. Beautiful composition. You've still got the eye. And then, after a moment's consideration, I added, Thank you for seeing me more clearly now. I'm trying to do the same for you. The light changed, urging me forward, I accelerated into the gathering dusk, heading home, to my quiet brownstone with its spaces designed perfectly for one. My home. My life. My choices, but no longer a fortress against maternal disappointment. Just a place where I existed on my own terms, with newfound appreciation for the woman who had raised me, not as a reflection of herself, but as an independent soul with her own destiny to fulfill, just as she was finally discovering for herself.